I spent 5 months searching for a product manager job, and after 10 roles, 35 interviews, and countless rejections, I've made it out to the other side. Here's my experience and the lessons I learned along the way. I wouldn't normally make a video like this, but my job search experience was so challenging and isolating that I felt compelled to document it. My hope is that my experience can make you feel less alone in your search, or if no one watches this, at the very least, I can look back and remind myself that I am capable of doing hard things. Here are the main themes I'll talk about. I've broken them up into different lessons across 4 buckets, and I've also added timestamps in the description in case you want to jump to relevant sections. When I first started interviewing, I didn't have a very structured or intentional process. I took the occasional interview when I could squeeze it in between work meetings and prepped very minimally. I assumed that since I interview and evaluate a lot of PM candidates, I would naturally be fine if the roles were reversed, but I was very wrong. After bombing a few interviews, I realized that I would need to put in much more effort if I was taking this seriously. Of course, in true PM fashion, this meant creating a spreadsheet to track roles, and I carved out time dedicated to researching and bookmarking open roles, polishing my resume, and interview prep. Here's my actual tracking spreadsheet. From start to finish, I was searching for 5 months. I did at least a recruiter screen for 10 different roles and completed a total of 35 interviews. In addition to the tracking spreadsheet, I also had separate Google Docs for each role, which served as a one-stop shop for the job description, any context provided by the recruiter, responses I prepped for questions I expected to be asked, and I documented every question I was asked during the interview process. I completely understand why some people say job searching is itself a full-time job, because the process really does take over your time and mind share, especially when you're juggling multiple active applications at once. At any given moment, I had 2 to 3 active roles in the pipeline, which was the maximum of what I could manage on top of my day job. This meant I would periodically apply to a new batch of roles as the process wrapped up for roles further along in the pipeline so that I would always have something in progress. I also found it valuable to reflect on what I wanted in my next role, so I wasn't taking a spray and pray approach and wasting my time on roles that didn't make sense in the context of my career journey. For me, I've been observing an evolution in PM craft and skill set with the rise of AI, and I was worried that continuing in a middle manager role would quickly make me out of touch and obsolete. So I was looking for a company that was a leading innovator in the next era of tech, and I also wanted to go back to be a senior IC. The last time I looked for a new PM job was in 2020, during the height of tech hiring. Getting job offers back then was like shooting fish in a barrel. Because things had gone so smoothly back then, I went into this process severely underestimating how difficult it would be. My understanding of the current climate is that the number of applicants far exceeds open roles, so hiring managers can be super picky. AI has exacerbated this problem. Candidates can apply to way more jobs because they automate the application process. And then on the flip side, hiring managers are using AI to screen out candidates. So it's a miracle for your application to even be seen by a real human. I've also been on the other side of the process and sat through interview debriefs where candidates successfully pass all of the rounds, but at the very end, the hiring manager might just think they aren't the best fit and reject them. So I can completely understand how candidates can be perfect throughout the whole process and still get a rejection. There was one role where I finished the entire interview process and even got positive feedback, but the recruiter said they still wanted to talk to a few more candidates. They kept me on the hook for 2.5 months before I was finally rejected. After a string of rejections, I definitely felt myself losing confidence. You start to feel insane and like you're trying to complete some Sisyphean task, repeating the same process over and over again, hoping for a different outcome. You invest so much time going through all of the rounds of the process, and as you get close to the end, you start to feel hopeful and envision what your life might look like in this role. And then when you get the bad news, it feels like such a crushing blow to be back at square one. I know it's easier said than done, but don't let rejections kill your confidence. There are so many factors outside of our control that influence these decisions. When you do finally get that yes, it'll make sense that all of the previous rejections happened so that you could be available for this opportunity. I previously mentioned that I think the rise of AI has lowered the response rate of directly submitting job applications. From my experience, it's still possible to get a response, but it takes a longer time for the recruiter to find your resume among the mountain of submissions. There was a role where the time between me applying and then getting a recruiter response was more than 2 months. I found it helpful to diversify my tactics for applying through a mix of referrals, direct outreach to recruiters, and recruiter inbound. I had some wonderful past colleagues who graciously helped submit referrals on my behalf. I also took some calls from recruiters who reached out to me if I was interested in that company. But my favorite story is for the role that I ended up accepting the offer for. So 5 years ago, when I was in business school, I co-chaired the tech conference and was responsible for finding keynote speakers. The chief product officer at the time was one of the keynote speakers that I invited, and then through coordinating his participation, I got connected to one of the recruiters at this company. Then, when it was time to apply for post-business school jobs, I applied for a PM role. The timing didn't quite work out back then, but fast forward 5 years later, and I noticed that the same recruiter was still there and reached out to her again. So here are the real emails that I sent to the same recruiter more than 5 years apart. It's also coincidental that the role I applied for 5 years ago is for the same team I will now be joining. So I love how it's such a full circle moment. This leads me into my next lesson about the value of your extended network. Once I started interviewing, I just kept bumping into people I knew or shared mutuals with everywhere. It started with the first company I interviewed with. So when he learned what my current company was, the hiring manager asked if I knew someone who happened to be my previous manager. Coincidentally, he was trying to hire her for a senior director role, but she didn't seem too interested. My next anecdote was even crazier. The recruiter sent over a calendar invite with info about who my interviewer would be, and I recognized the name as someone who used to be a past colleague. I emailed the recruiter letting him know about the connection, and so he swapped out my interviewer for a different person. But turns out I knew that person too. I knew the name seemed familiar, but I couldn't place how I knew him exactly. So I looked him up on LinkedIn to see if we overlapped at the same school or at the same company, and we didn't. And then in a sudden moment of realization, I looked him up on Facebook, and it turns out we were in the same summer camp group in high school 17 years ago. And it wasn't just any summer camp, it was West Point summer camp. So here's a picture of me at West Point summer camp. At the very end of our interview, when it was my turn to ask questions, I asked him, "Do you know this isn't our first time meeting?" He didn't remember me, but he did pass me on the interview. So long story short, don't burn bridges. You never know when someone you went to summer camp with almost 20 years ago is in a position to determine the fate of your career. ChatGPT was such a powerful companion in my job search, but I found it most useful as a tool for enhancing rather than replacing my thinking. Here are 3 ways I use ChatGPT. First, I used it for fine-tuning and tailoring my resume. Once I had an initial draft of my resume, ChatGPT helped me tweak the language so that the wording was more aligned with the job description. Second, I used it to prepare for interviews. I took all of the context about the role, the job description, all of the info shared by the recruiter, and details about the interviewers themselves, and I dumped all of that into ChatGPT. Then I asked it to simulate a 45-minute interview by taking on the role of the interviewer. It should ask me a mix of behavioral and situational questions, plus follow-up questions where appropriate. Then it should rate me at the end on what I was doing well and where I needed improvement. It was really impressive that there were a handful of cases where ChatGPT accurately predicted exactly the questions I was later asked. And even if the questions weren't an exact match, it was still helpful to have prepped those frameworks and have thought through the types of problems I was likely to be asked about. I'm not great at recruiting, specifically coming up with thoughtful interview responses on the fly, so this type of practice was so helpful. Lastly, I used ChatGPT to help me negotiate from a more level playing field when it came to the offer stage. Candidates are often in a position of information asymmetry when negotiating offers because we just don't do this very often. I was fortunate to end up with 2 offers, so I found it helpful to ask ChatGPT to compare and contrast their differences, provide recommendations on where I had leverage to negotiate, and then how to frame the negotiation so I came across fair and not entitled for asking for too much. Where I avoided using ChatGPT was in directly generating responses to interview questions. This was a constraint that I gave myself because I felt that memorizing the responses would not be as good for learning compared to writing out those responses myself. One of the questions I was asked most frequently about my job search is whether the standard interview playbook of product sense, product execution, and behavioral leadership questions has changed to evaluate AI expertise. In my experience, these core competencies are still the main things addressed in the interview process, even by AI-forward companies. However, the sense and execution questions may require you to think through unique AI challenges because the product at the center of the case study question is an AI product. As an interviewer, I've also refreshed my go-to questions to be more relevant to the AI moment. For example, my previous go-to product execution question was, imagine you're the PM of YouTube Shorts, which is just about to launch. How would you measure success? In the past year, I've finally retired that question because it was getting super outdated, and it's now, imagine you're the PM of Spotify's AI DJ. How would you measure success? So in addition to assessing a candidate's grasp of the standard engagement, adoption, quality metrics, I'm also interested in whether they have intuition about the unique quirks of AI products. For example, how are you doing offline and online evaluations of AI risks like hallucinations or biases or insensitivity? Let's talk a bit about the different types of product manager interviews. Every role had some version of a product sense / strategy and product execution question. One of my observations was that nearly all of my product sense and execution questions were related to the company and role I was interviewing for. So as a candidate, I was at a bit of a disadvantage because my intuition about the problem space would not be as well developed as my interviewer whose entire job is focused on this area. This meant that if the interviewer asked follow-up questions that seemed to nudge me in a slightly different direction than where I was going, I used it as a hint or an opportunity to pivot and get on track rather than pushing back. Product sense has always been my Achilles heel in the interview process because I am very bad at coming up with ideas on the fly, especially when there's pressure to demonstrate out-of-the-box thinking. The way that I approached my weakness was honestly just doing a lot of practice. I asked ChatGPT to give me a bunch of short drills to practice the basic components of a product sense question, like coming up with unique personas and their use cases, or practicing the divergent versus convergent process of coming up with lots of different product ideas and then honing in on the best one. So here's a screenshot of a drill ChatGPT gave me and then my response. Once I submitted my response, it would give me detailed feedback of my strengths and areas of improvement. And then after a few rounds of drills, I would then ask ChatGPT for interview prompts and then do the full end-to-end response. For product execution, my approach was to prepare frameworks that would be useful for each product. This meant thinking through 2 main areas. One was this product success metrics and how this likely contributed to overall business outcomes. And then the second was thinking through likely trade-offs and how a PM would prioritize between these trade-offs. Situational stories about my past work and leadership experience were the most transferable as I interviewed for different roles. I created this summary table and filled it with a strong story for each scenario. For each one, I had a one-liner intro to tee up the story, and then I used the SBI, Situation, Behavior, Impact framework to write out the substance of each story. I also had a one-liner reflection to summarize what my learning or takeaway was from that situation. The biggest tip for behavioral questions is to make sure your story reflects the level of seniority you're interviewing for. For example, everyone will be asked about a time they resolved conflict, but a senior candidate should be talking about driving alignment across different orgs, while a junior candidate might talk about resolving conflict between teammates. So when I was preparing my stories, I focused on situations where I was communicating upward to senior leaders, driving alignment across teams, or impacting important top-line metrics. You're also guaranteed to be asked to tell me about yourself and why this company, why this role. So I made sure to have tailored answers to these questions for each role. As I'm wrapping up the interview types, I'll also briefly mention the interviews I came across that fell outside the standard case study and behavioral questions. There was one interview I did with a data scientist with a SQL portion where I was asked to review a few SQL queries and describe what the output would be. I was fortunate that I never had to do a take-home assignment, but I've heard from peers who recently went through the recruiting process that take-home assignments are still quite common, so I think I just got lucky. There was one role where I voluntarily did a take-home assignment because I wrapped up all of the interviews and felt like there were still more ideas I still wanted to share. My hope was that it would demonstrate my continued interest and show excitement about the product, but I have no idea if they read it. Plus, I didn't get the role, so I'm not sure I would do that again. At the end of every interview, it's guaranteed the interviewer will give you time to ask questions. This is a great opportunity to end the interview on a high note by asking thoughtful questions and to gather some insights about what the company and role is really like behind the scenes. I usually prepared 3 to 5 questions and did a mix of general questions and questions that were specifically tailored to that interviewer. These days, you're able to find so much information about your interviewer on LinkedIn, like their past experience, projects, publications, and this is a huge advantage to be able to ask hyper-specific questions that show you've done your homework. So, for example, you might ask, hey, I saw you used to work at company X. From my understanding, their culture is pretty different. What similarities or differences did you observe when you joined company Y? I also had some go-to questions that were more generic. My absolute favorite question that I asked to every product leader was, what is leadership most excited about regarding your product strategy/roadmap, and what parts of the strategy are they most interested in influencing? I really like this question because it shows how much value leadership places on the team you'd be joining and whether there's a good balance between leadership interest versus overreach. Some red flags you might get from an answer to this question might be leadership isn't very involved, which is a sign that the team isn't a priority. On the flip side, an answer that leadership is driving the strategic decisions also is a red flag because it just suggests the team is executing on top-down mandates rather than given the autonomy to own their own roadmap. They say hindsight is 20/20, so if I were to run it back and change anything about my job search approach, here are the 3 things that I would do differently. First, I would be more strategic in the sequencing of roles I interviewed for. Interviewing is very much a skill, and like with any skill, you get better with practice. The more interviewing you do, the better you get, and you'll also start to see patterns in the types of questions you're asked. If there are roles you're less excited about, you can do them earlier for practice because the stakes are lower if you do poorly. Second, I would have prepared ready-to-go responses for the most common product sense and execution questions. One hiring manager asked me, what product do you think is well designed? What do you like about it? And what would you fix? Which is the most softball question, but I completely choked and messed it up. In the future, I'll plan to have the answer for this question for 3 of my favorite products. And lastly, I wouldn't be so hard on myself when I got rejected. I really beat myself up and Anytime an interview went badly, I would let that negativity ruin my day. It also would then impact subsequent interviews because I showed up less confident. The best thing to do is to extract the learnings from the rejection and use that as fuel to do better next time. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Hope this was helpful and good luck with your job search.